Hello and welcome to the Embodied Psyche. I'm very excited about today's interview. We have on the show Betty Martin, who's a personal hero of mine. I think of her as a queen of consent. She's done a lot of work developing the wheel of consent, a method known as the bossy massage, and many other tools for getting in touch with your personal embodiment and your sense of pleasure. Betty, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you. That's funny, the queen of consent. Well, I mess up on consent as often as anybody else. But I did develop the wheel of consent, so I guess I get some credit for that.
What would you prefer rather than queen?
That's great. It's just kind of a chuckle.
Okay, good. I like the acknowledgement of the mess ups. I think that's an important factor. Certainly, I mess up too. And one of the things I like to do is think of consent more as an orientation than a state of yes or no. How do you work through the mess ups?
Well, I apologize when I can. And I think part of it has been a process over the years of noticing more exquisitely when I understand consent more exquisitely. Then I can notice where I mess up. Whereas if I just think of, well, consent means yes or no, and that's all it is, and it's pretty easy to get by on that. But when I understand consent as being a more nuanced agreement about what we are both interested in, what we both want, what we both don't want, who's giving, who's receiving, who's it for, and being clear about those things, then I notice, oh, I wasn't really very clear about that. For example, instead of saying, I may say to someone, how would you like to go out to lunch? Well, is that me asking them to go out for lunch? Or is it me asking them for, will you go out to lunch with me so I can tell you what I'm thinking about? Or is it, would you like me to take you to lunch to listen to how it is for you? Or is it an invitation to let's just go out together? When I start to notice that there's a difference between those things, then I can take more responsibility for asking for what it is that I actually want, which may be, I'd like you to take you to lunch so that I can pick your brain about that project you're talking about. Would you do that for me? That's a very different question than how about lunch? And so what I notice is that as I get more aware of those distinctions, I can clean up taking responsibility for what I want and actually asking for it.
I love your phrasing, exquisite awareness of consent. And certainly I feel like I'm going through my own process of awakening to the exquisite nature of deep consent and responsibility for desire. I'm just curious, as someone who's navigating this new deep awareness in a world that often has a lot of ambiguity in communication, is there any role that ambiguity plays in the development of relationship? Like, is there a dance of vague flirtation that happens in courtship, for example?
Sure. I think we largely build our relationships on ambiguity sometimes. And that's why we end up in relationships which later we say, how did I get here? Or this is really not what I was interested in. How did I end up here? So yeah, ambiguity, sure, we do that a lot. And as far as asking for what we want, I think we can be very ambiguous, like the, let's go to lunch example. Or, would you like XYZ? When actually we're the ones that want XYZ, but we're not admitting it. And so we're saying, would you like XYZ? And they say they don't really want it either, but they think that we want it because they're used to people being ambiguous. And so they say, yeah. And so we end up with XYZ and neither of us really wants it. I've been there. It's not a place that I recommend. I imagine most people have been there.
I've certainly been there too.
Yeah.
So I think what I'm understanding is that as we clean up the clarity of what we want, there's almost universally better results. Would you say so?
I would say so. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like an effective sorting mechanism for getting to people who are really on board with mutual desire.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. Yeah.
So, I've reviewed quite a lot of your public facing material. I really appreciate how many resources you make available to people for free online.
Okay.
Um, but I have all of this lingering curiosity about
Okay.
like your personal journey, how you arrived at this work. Would
Yeah.
you be willing to open up a little bit about how consent became so meaningful to you?
Sure. Um, in my mid 40s, after a divorce, I took a workshop with the Body Electric School called Celebrating the Body Erotic. This was for women. And it was a weekend. It was very physical, very hands-on. You know, it was a lot of nakedness and exploring, and it just blew the lid off my little white picket fence eroticism. And I learned there that my Eros belonged to me. And the aha was so strong that it made me wonder, well, who did I think it belonged to? Like, you know, and I look back on my life and I realized that as a person who's raised in the 1950s and 1960s, I thought that I was taught that my Eros belonged to everybody else. Like how I'm supposed to look, how I'm supposed to want, what I'm supposed to want, what I'm supposed to not want, what I'm supposed to say no to, you know, what kind of desire I'm supposed to have, what kind of desire I'm not supposed to have, how I'm supposed to respond to everybody else's desire. I mean, all those things were programmed in. And and this kind of big aha in my mid 40s of, oh, it's mine. It comes from my body and my impulses and my feelings and my urges, and like I can bring it out to play if and when I choose and with whom I choose and how I choose. Well, that was a huge aha. Then I spent a number of years exploring with some cohorts, and we kind of started where the workshops took off, and I took a bunch of other workshops and was assisted at the workshops. And this went on for a number of years, exploring what is Eros? Like, what is it? What does it mean when it's not about hooking up with someone? It's not about it's not about this kind of sex. It's like, okay, what is my body capable of experiencing? What are the feelings that arise when I do? And how much sensation, what kinds of sensation are there? Well, it turns out there's a lot. And what does it mean to me in my awareness and my personal development and who I am as a person and who I am as a woman? So all these questions were just really, I really dove into them. It was a spiritual path for some years. And after, I don't know, 6 or 8 years of that or something, I decided I wanted to offer this to other people, wanted to offer some of these experiences and support to other people. And so I closed my chiropractic practice. I was a chiropractor for a number of years. I closed that office and moved from a small town into the big city, into Seattle, and opened another practice as a sex coach. And I was working, I was clothed, they were clothed or partially clothed, and was I was a clinician. I knew how to take a history and all that stuff, you know, so I knew how to be with people. And I had taught peer counseling for 30 years too, so I knew how to be with people in their feelings and experimenting. And somewhere during that, so that was where my own eroticism developed, and it was out of my own experimenting that grew the interest to help others. I didn't start out wanting to be a sex coach or a sex worker or anything. It grew out of my own exploring in that field. And I was, 50 years old, so yeah, I wasn't starting too soon. And somewhere during those course of workshops over the years, I took another course with the Body Electric School called Power, Surrender, and Intimacy. And we played this game called the 3-minute game. And it's a game that two people play, or two or more. And you take turns asking each other these two questions. And the questions are, what do you want to do to me for 3 minutes? And then what do you want me to do to you for 3 minutes? And then you do whatever you agreed on. And you'll notice that if there's two people and there's two questions, there's going to be 4 rounds of the game. And I noticed that when you play 4 rounds of this game, that you end up with 4 very different experiences. Either I'm doing what I want or I'm doing what you want. And there's a big difference there. And likewise, you're doing what you want or you're doing what I want. And there's a big difference there. And so I noticed that, and that's where the wheel of consent came from just playing that game with hundreds of people and noticing that these are really 4 very different experiences. And then I really dove in and kept exploring that. And then I started teaching that, and now I teach it in workshops. And now I just finished a book. That's the review copy. That's looking for the mistakes in it and finding them. So that's where this work came from. And that's where my interest in consent came from. Before, I can't say that it was a particular main issue for me. I was reasonably functional. I could say yes or no, but like most people, I often said yes when I didn't really want to, because I thought I'm supposed to or something. And I found out that, well, just about everybody does that. So yeah, that's where that came from. And then because I started teaching the Wheel of Consent and took that all over the place and put the stuff online, and that's when I found myself in the middle of more conversations about consent, which are just fabulous nowadays. I mean, there's so much great conversation on consent. And the contribution that the Wheel of Consent makes to this larger conversation is not that consent is a good thing. You already knew that. And it's not that it's okay to say no and have boundaries and so forth. A lot of people are talking about that, and it's really great. The contribution that the Wheel of Consent makes to that larger conversation is that agreeing what you're going to do or not do is only half the question. The other half the question is, who is it for? So I might have my hands on your back, but is it what you want me to do, or is it what I'm wanting to do? And that makes all the difference. So that's the piece that the Wheel of Consent brings in, is that there's 2 factors. There's who's going to do what, and then there's who's it for. And that's what the wheel talks about. Yeah.
I really appreciate that. And I like the title of your book. I think it was The Art of Giving and Receiving. Is that correct? Yeah, I think that really encapsulates it.
Yeah.
You mentioned your spiritual awakening into Eros, your erotic journey.
Mm-hmm.
And I get really curious about what the interplay is between that particular facet of interpersonal relationship and maybe something like love or commitment. How do those 2 kinds of relationship dance with each other?
Well, first of all, your Eros is not about relationship, it's about you. I can have a very erotic life and not be in a relationship. And I can have a very erotic experiences that don't involve anybody else. And I'm not talking just about masturbation, which may or may not be erotic at all. I'm talking about experiences of my sensory experiences that are enlivening to me and wake me up. It may be, walking through the woods. It may be eating an ice cream. It could be lots of things. It may be self-touch, or it may be somebody else touching me. So Eros doesn't really depend on anybody else. Your Eros belongs to you, and it arises from you, and in ways that sometimes surprise you, and sometimes you kind of develop, and sometimes you kind of discover. And once we own our own eroticism, then we can choose, oh, I want to bring it out to play with this person. Or, oh, I'm not that person. I want to bring it out to play with this person. And I want to bring it out to play in this way. Or, and if we do that, we may decide that we want to be in a more complex relationship with this person, or we might not. There's many, many kinds of relationship. I mean, often when people say relationship, they mean like the relationship with a capital R, where there's two of us and we're like looking at each other and we're all in this thing together. And that's one way. There can also be friendships. There can be relationships that are very intimate emotionally, but not physically. There can be relationships that are very intimate physically, but not emotionally. And you may or may not be financially intimate with that person. You may live with them, you may not. You may share children with them that you may not. There's infinite variety of kinds of relationships. And some of them will include some Eros and some of them won't. And that changes over time. Maybe you're erotic with somebody this year, and then that kind of changes into another kind of relationship where it's not erotic really anymore, but maybe it's very intimate emotionally, or maybe it's the other way around. So the idea that relationship is supposed to fit into this is the way you do relationship, I think is a really, it's a sad loss of a lot of other possibilities as well. Yeah. So there's Eros. Maybe it's like a Venn diagram. There's Eros, and there's relationship, and sometimes they overlap, and sometimes they don't.
Yeah. That makes sense to me. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm wondering also about this enlivening awakening into Eros as a sensory experience, as something that's not just about sensuality, but also, or other kinds of sensuality, touch, sensory experiences. It seems to me as though many people, some of my clients even, have a hard time feeling safe to allow their sensory self to really wake up.
Sure.
And they can have very functional lives, very rational lives. But there's something about the emergence of that pleasure and aliveness that feels threatening. Sure. How do you work with that when that comes up in your clients?
Well, first of all, it's entirely natural to resist pleasure and embodiment, because we have all been hurt when we were in our bodies. So even just as small children being handled or mishandled, or, we had to brush our teeth and we didn't want to. I mean, when we get hurt, it's in our bodies. And so if we've been hurt a lot in our bodies and we haven't had the opportunity yet to kind of re-inhabit, then when we start to come back into our bodies, by which I mean noticing the sensations of your body primarily, then it's going to feel threatening. So I do this little exercise where you take an object in your hand and you feel it and you see what's enjoyable. And suddenly it's enjoyable, and then, oh shit, now I'm in trouble. Now I'm back in my body, and now all this fear comes up because that's what happened before. So, you know, so it's not uncommon at all for the experiences of body, even enjoyment, can be challenging and threatening because we don't really know what to do with it. And this is not just like people who've had a lot of trauma. This is everybody. This is we not very good in this culture. Certainly in this white North American culture that we're in, or I'm assuming you're in, that feelings is not something we really do very well. We overdo them, we underdo them, we confuse them. We're just a kind of a mess in that way. But so when we get back in our bodies, when we start noticing our sensation, feelings come up, and what do we do about that? So we shut them down again. And different people struggle with different kinds of feelings, I think. But it's very common that pleasure and pleasantness and enjoyment is challenging for very, very many people. It's very, very common. And so in answer to your question about how I work with them, generally speaking, I work very slowly and gently because there's no point in overwhelming anyone ever. That if you can sustain a little bit of pleasure in your hands, and then when it gets to be too much, then stop so that you don't overwhelm yourself. This is called titrating. You take a little nibble and then you step back. You take another little nibble and then you step back. And that way you gradually gain the nervous system infrastructure that you need in order to sustain and enjoy more intense sensations. And that's part of what was happening in those years that I was doing that exploring. A lot of it was about how increasing my ability to sustain and enjoy increasingly intense sensation. That probably be a good description of one aspect of what we're doing.
Yeah, let's go back to that for a little bit. Your awakening and your experience with the body electric. When I imagine someone going from a 1950s upbringing and a pretty traditional marriage to an environment where suddenly they're in a workshop with a lot of nudity, a lot of touch, I could imagine that even being a threatening or traumatic experience.
Yeah.
How did you work with your sense of consent in an environment that jarring and different from your day-to-day life?
Besides growing up in the 50s, I was a hippie, so I was naked in lots of different groups. Like, that was nothing new. So that part was easy. And it was led and held in such a very careful and wise step by step by step, so that by the time Sunday afternoon came, we as a group were doing things that we never would have imagined when we got there Friday night. If someone had told me Friday night, you're going to be doing this on Sunday afternoon, I'd have said, what? So a lot of it was by careful holding the container, by welcoming the feelings that came up, by taking it step by step. So that each step was an opening and a relief. And I imagined, so it was challenging in the sense that it was like, here's my edge and here's what I'm learning and wow. But it wasn't shocking. I imagine that there are definitely people for whom that would be way too much too fast. Absolutely. And so they offer different kinds of workshops for different situations. But in my case, I didn't find it shocking. I think because because I'd been a hippie, but I did. But it was challenging in all the best ways of like, oh my gosh, okay, here we are. Now what, you know? And there was consent built in that there were invitations to do this exercise, for example, but you could also sit out or, you know, yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I was asked a somewhat provocative question fairly recently that's really been in my head lately. And the question was something like, if we're ready to acknowledge that trauma happens to almost everyone in either small or large ways, and that there's an impact that's held in the physical body, does that mean that historically, looking back at the long span of human existence, most people were walking around their lives numb, traumatized, and unable to experience pleasure?
Oh, that's a pretty strong statement. Most people unable to experience pleasure. I have no way to know that. However, I do imagine that for much of human history and for most of the people in human history, that we lived under social conditions which were repressive in different ways, either physically repressive, exploitative. You know, we were the laborers in the field, we didn't have a choice, or we were enslaved or enslaving other people, or, you know, the plague came through and wiped everybody. I mean, it was awful conditions in many ways for many people over eons. So whether there was much pleasure happening, I hope there was some pleasure happening. Also, we look back like the Middle Ages, for example, in Europe and in most other cultures, I think there's also an opportunity for community celebration, community ritual. There was communal kinds of celebration and joy, which we don't have so much of now, though we have to create it. So, you know, this is what I imagine. I don't know if it's actually true, but, you know, for much of history, a lot of people were really repressed and squashed down and miserable. And we humans can find joy in places that are just miraculous and fabulous. Even if it doesn't seem like much to our modern eyes, it was a pretty big deal to them. So yeah, I think we have all been traumatized. It's all on some scale. You know, you may have been treated really well and with great respect and care, and you still had stuff happen to you because you're a kid. I mean, you can't be a kid and not have to do stuff you don't want to do. Just that's part of being a kid. And so, you know, maybe you may have been treated really well and still had this, and then you had your big brother hit you and you got, you know, beat up at school, and then all this completely horrendous aggressions from your family, from outside your family, from the cops, you know, so there's this huge range in the mistreatment and the trauma that we've been subjected to. And so, yeah, this affects learning consent because, well, several ways. One is that because we are so used to going along with stuff that we don't like, that we start to feel normal. And so someone asks you how you want to be touched, and you, instead of thinking that you actually could be touched in some way that you want, you think, well, how is it that I don't mind terribly much being touched, which is a very different question.
Mm.
And I learned this with my clients. I would say, how do you want to be touched for a few minutes? And they would say, well, you can such and such. Well, it's true, I could, but that's not what I asked you. I asked you what you wanted. Oh, like they didn't even hear that. And yeah, this happens all the time. So there's that aspect of it. Um, and then there's the ongoing social trauma of being raised in a marginalized group, whether it has to do with race or gender or orientation or whatever, that um, we gradually learn that there's really no choice. Like we have to go along with stuff that we don't like in order to keep ourselves alive. And so how does that affect consent? Hell yes. It affects who we can feel empowered to say yes or no to, and who we feel empowered to demand things of. And so, yeah, it has a big effect on our ability to consent and the practice of consent, both interpersonally at home in the bedroom and on the street in wider sphere.
One of the interesting ironies I found myself thinking about lately is that as I've begun to, offer consent workshop work in my own life, a lot of people say, oh gosh, I wish I'd gotten this education earlier in
Yeah,
school.
yeah.
And I think, of course, yes. And then I started formulating, okay, what if we did a lesson plan that we could drop in to be compatible with public schools? But then you have the problem of the coercive environment that is public education itself.
Yes. Right. Right. You have to go to this workshop. It's on consent. How does that fit? Yeah.
Yeah. So it's just an interesting irony. And I do think there's this funny interplay as you become kind of awakened to this notion of the pursuit of personal pleasure and Eros, that I certainly still feel like I'm part of a society. And sometimes I'm willing to do things that I don't necessarily want to do. So is that true consent or is that something else? It seems like there are these levels where we go in and out of whether we're really able to embody desire and joy. And it can be very functional. Say you're working for a company, it's functional to have meetings.
Yeah. Yeah. Consent, the way I'm using it, well, if you look in the dictionary, consent means you agree to do something. It's implied that it's what somebody else wants. And it may be something that you're totally happy to do and thrilled to do. It may be something that, yeah, I can make that work. And it may be something that just barely, like, only for you, baby, am I willing to do this. So there's this full range there of willingness, and willingness fits in consent. Will you scratch my back right here? Sure, I'll do that. Like, I'm consenting to that. Does that mean that I would otherwise be scratching your back if you hadn't asked for it? No, I probably wouldn't, but I'm happy to do it because you want it. Sure. And yes, that counts as consent.
Yeah. So I think certainly like accepting a job and the obligations of a job fall into that kind of consent. When we do get into like being a child and being under other people's power, maybe not quite so much.
Yeah. 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 There's an awful lot of unconsent that we have as kids. Just part of the necessity of growing up.
Or as you brought up, if you're in a marginalized group, there may be like huge systemic imbalances and economic imbalances.
Absolutely.
So even if we're theoretically willing, it's willing within a system of disempowerment.
Yeah.
All of these nuances I find so fascinating.
Yeah. 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 We most of my work has been with individuals and couples and, friends and people working and because it's about sex, or it has been about sex, it's about this intimate relationship that is one-on-one and it's behind closed doors for the most part, and it's hopefully between peers, although that's not always the case. But when you expand it out into the street and the world at large, it's a very different question. You know, if I'm a young man of color and I get stopped by the policeman and I'm in my car, there's a lot of restrictions on what I can do if I expect to live through the experience. You know, so it becomes much more complex outside the house.
I'm curious about the work that you have done with clients and what you've seen shift as people shift their relationship to giving and receiving. Could you dive into that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, one is that getting clear on the difference between what I want and what I'm willing to do, and how that will free up the relationship, because you're no longer trying to guess what the other person wants, or you're more clear on, I don't really want this for myself, but I'm happy to do it if it's something that you want. And that kind of clarity changes relationships. And deeper than that, so what I do is mostly really, really simple. I'm asking the client how they would like me to touch them. I mean, we've already talked and all that stuff. How would they like me to touch them for a few minutes? And that question is so simple that it's very challenging. And so it causes, so then people have to pause and notice, oh, wait a minute. Am I allowed to want something? Am I allowed to ask for it? Do I even know what it is that I want? Is what I want enough? Is what I want too much? Is what I want the right thing? Blah, 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 blah. So just by asking people that simple question causes it can be emotionally challenging, also brings out lots of ahas about, oh my gosh, I didn't know I felt that way. And oh my gosh, I have been thinking that my job was always to give. And I come to find out that it's okay for me to enjoy something too. That's a huge breakthrough for many people. And it's okay for me to change my mind in the middle. That's a huge breakthrough for people. And there are things that, we could have a conversation about them and it may be useful, but when we have a somatic experience of it, then you get it. Then you experience, oh my gosh, this is what it feels like to have something that's actually for me. Oh my gosh, this is what it feels like. I never knew what it felt like before. And so it's because the experiences are somatic that they are so life-changing. So mostly what I do is it's really, really simple. It's like we remove all the complexities of relationship and blah, 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 and just do this one thing. How do you want me to touch you for a few minutes? And it brings it into the light of day of what the dynamic really is. And that changes people.
Yeah, I really appreciate that you're doing that work. Even as someone who's, sought out body work or somatic work myself, sometimes I think practitioners are unclear about those dynamics themselves and can be imposing an agenda.
Yeah, that's why I train them.
Good. I'm glad you're doing that work.
Yeah.
I'd love to return to that spiritual metaphor for the path that you've been on. And it strikes me as being a little bit akin to the path of the Bodhisattva. You had this divine experience of the awakening of the erotic, and you felt compelled to share this with others and bring them into this awakening themselves. How has that affected your relationship to touch to often be in that role of professionally being a giver?
That's kind of two different questions.
We can separate them out.
Yeah, let's take them out. So the first one was the awakening and wanting to offer it to others. That was a gradual process. I wouldn't say I wouldn't say I'm awakened, but I'm waking up, you know. And when I described it in those years as a spiritual path, I think what I was spiritual is not a word that I use very much. I can't even tell what it means anymore, because it used to be that, you know, there was spiritual and there was physical, and they were kind of different. And, you know, and then I found that the more physical my experiences were, the more I just focused on what is the sensation right now, that the more spiritual they felt. The more they took me to altered states, the more they took me to ahas, the more they took me to personal growth and personal awareness. And so this physical and the spiritual began to be the same, and now they are the same. And I don't know what it's all spiritual or it's nothing spiritual. I can't tell the difference. But
wait, let's stay with that for just a second, because part of my own background is I was a classicist before I was a psychology person. So if you go before Christianity, body and spirit were the same.
Yeah, okay.
So I think you might be returning to the traditional understanding of spirit.
Well, that was just my experience. And also in that process over those years, I learned to trust my experience more than any idea about it. I don't really care what you call it. I don't care if you call it spiritual. I don't care if you call it, you know, chakras. I don't care if you call it energy. I don't care what you call it. What I care is what's happening in your body right now, and what does it feel like? That's the door into self-awareness, self-development, joy, everything. That's the door in. So I don't really, and people have all kinds of theories about this spiritual thing, and this means this, and this chakra means that, and I don't really care. I just don't care. What I care about is what's happening right now in your body, in my body. And I learned to trust that more than anything else. And I still do. I'm on a journey, I guess you'd say, of becoming more aware of my own sensations, and including the ones that are unpleasant. You know, I have a knot in my belly, then, you know, something's going on either in here or out in the world or something. And so I want to pay attention to that knot in my belly and give it all of my attention and see what happens, see what it tells me, see what it reveals. And it may be something that I don't like, it may be something that I like, it may be something that's very inconvenient, or it may be something that really shoots a hole in my ego. I don't care. I just want to be with what is happening right now. That's my intention.
Because I think you said that those were two separate questions, but I feel like you've arrived at the answer to the second one through the exploration of the first. Maybe. It seems like both do have this present sensation flavor to them.
I think you're asking about how it's changed my experience of touch, being a professional toucher.
Yes.
Well, I've gotten really good at it. I was a professional toucher already, being a chiropractor. And so I was very confident with my hands, and I knew how to take in a lot of information with my hands. And working with clients as a surrogate and later as a sex worker, and it's very easy to tell when a person touches me. It became very easy to tell how relaxed they were, how confident they were. There's a quality of touch that you learn by playing the 3-minute game and playing with the wheel of consent. There's a quality of touch that develops, which is wonderful to be touched with. And I became increasingly unwilling to be touched with a low quality of touch. This happened gradually over, 5 to 6 years. My body became increasingly resistant to being touched with the low quality of touch. And eventually it's part of what drove me out of the work. Also, we change, we become interested in different things. And so I did that work until it wasn't fun anymore, and then I didn't do it anymore. But that was one factor. But I still love touch, and I'll be if there's a puppy pile going on, I'll be right in the middle of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that brings me to curiosity around having touch needs met, you as a professional, and then also within the spans of this time period where it's harder for most people to find touch when there are health reasons.
We don't have cuddle parties anymore.
Right.
Yeah. As a professional, it's really, especially as a touch professional. So massage therapist, physical therapist, surrogate partner, sex worker, sexological body worker, anything where you're touching people for money. It's really, really important that you get your touch needs met elsewhere. You cannot rely on your client to meet your touch needs. That's unfair to them, and it's unfair to you, and it doesn't work. Does it sometimes happen? Yeah. I enjoyed, for the most part, I enjoyed the touch with my clients. And so it sort of generally helped to keep my tank full. But you can't use your clients for that. And it comes across if you are. I mean, it just feels really creepy to a client, and they may or may not have the self-discernment to notice what it is, but it doesn't feel right. They know at some level.
Yeah. And along with that time period thing, the being in coronavirus right now and touch being less safe and cuddle parties not happening. I've heard some people speculate that we're going to see a lot of increased touch resistance even after this virus is gone or handled in a way that allows touch to emerge. Do you notice more guarding, more hesitancy? Do you imagine that there'll need to be kind of a rehabilitation process for society at large?
Probably. I notice for me, it's been a year now, or since we've been dealing with stuff. I notice for me, if I see somebody, even an old movie or something, somebody rushes in for a hug, I think, what are you doing? So I don't know. I imagine there probably will be some residual resistance. It may take us a while to get over it. I don't know. My guess is probably.
Yeah, I guess we'll have to cross that bridge when we come to it. But maybe that guidepost you have about staying with sensation in the moment as it's happening is
There'll probably also be a burgeoning of cuddle parties and things like that. People like, finally, jump in, I can imagine that happening as well.
It could definitely go that way too.
Yeah.
Often on this show, we'll close with something like a take-home exercise for viewers at home, something they can do alone with themselves. Do you have any suggestions? Maybe a short thing that they could do?
Yeah, this is on my website, and you can see it on my website, which I guess you can link there. But it's I call it waking up the hands, where your hand has more nerve endings than anywhere on your body other than your lips and genitals. And usually we use our hands to do things. And you can wake up your hands so that they become a source of pleasure to you. And to do that, you just lean back and get comfortable. Leaning back makes a difference instead of leaning forward. And pick up something, just some old thing sitting around, whatever, it's got a pin. And you normally you'd be sitting this on your lap, but I'm going to have my hands here. So you sit on your lap, put a pillow or something on your lap if it helps, and just feel the thing. And notice, what does this thing feel like? Where is it sharp? Where is it smooth? Where is it soft? And just stay there and play with it for a while. And you'll notice that after a while, the thing, it starts out being a pin. What does this pin feel like? And after a while, it doesn't matter what it is. It just becomes something to pleasure your hands with. So the sensation comes forward. It's like the sensation gets bigger and takes up more of your psychic space. And usually after a while, maybe a few minutes, maybe longer, it'll become kind of pleasant. It's really interesting. And if you hang out there with it long enough or come back to it a number of times, you'll notice that, oh, it feels really good. It kind of takes up the whole space inside your head. And it can bring up feelings as well because of what we talked about before with different feelings that you might have about sensation and certainly about pleasure. But it's a nice little experiment to play with and just see what happens. The key is to lean back, let your hand rest on your lap, and move your hands slowly, really slowly. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Waking up the hands. And I'm guessing it's a closed eye experience.
Either way, it's fine. Experiment. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah. Betty, this has been such a lovely conversation. I feel like I've learned so much from you. Thank you for taking the time to be with me here today.
My pleasure. My pleasure. I like what you're doing with your YouTube channel where you're bringing more embodiment in. There's things you can learn with your body that you learn no other way.
I really appreciate that. Yeah. And I'm looking forward to your book coming out.
Thank you. It'll just be a matter of weeks now.
Fantastic. Yeah. All right. So we'll be able to link to that on the site as well. So if our viewers want to check that out, it'll probably be below in about a week.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.